To the criminal underworld of Seoul, Lee Min-jae is a predator, a kingpin who rules with silence and violence. But inside these walls, he is a starving animal. He doesn't know that the woman in his arms has been stalking him for 3 years. He doesn't know she has a shrine of his photos hidden in her bag. All he knows is that since the accident, her voice is the only thing keeping his mind from shattering into a million pieces. 24 hours before his mind fractured into static, Lee Min-jae was a god walking among mortals. He stood on the rain-slicked steps of the fiercely exclusive Obsidian Club, the neon lights of Seoul reflecting off his tailored suit like armor. He checked his watch, the movement precise and lethal, ignoring the bow of the valet holding the door to his armored sedan. He was untouchable, a man who had curated a life of absolute silence and control. He didn't feel the cold. He didn't feel the rain. He felt nothing, which was exactly how he survived. Across the street, hidden in the narrow gap between a vending machine and a brick wall, Seo-yeon held her breath. The shutter of her camera clicked, a soft mechanical heartbeat against her fingertips. Through the telephoto lens, she traced the sharp line of his jaw, the dark circles under his eyes that no amount of money could hide. To the city, he was a monster. To her, he was a study in tragic geometry. She had 3 hard drives full of him. Min-jae drinking coffee alone. Min-jae staring at the river. Min-jae wiping blood off his knuckles. "Don't get in the car," she whispered, the words forming a cloud of condensation in the freezing air. She had seen the shadow in the garage earlier. She had seen the man in the blue coveralls linger too long by the rear axle of the sedan. She had tried to call the anonymous tip line at the precinct, but they had laughed her off as a prankster. Now, panic clawed at her throat. She zoomed in on the car door as he reached for the handle. "Look at me," she pleaded to the empty air, her knuckles white around the camera body. "Please, Min-jae, look this way, just once." He didn't. He never did. He slid into the back seat, sealing himself inside the tomb of leather and steel. The heavy door slammed shut, a sound of finality that made Seo-yeon flinch. The convoy began to move, tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Seo-yeon lowered the camera, a sick dread pooling in her stomach. She started running before the screeching began. It happened at the intersection of Hanam-dong. The brakes didn't fail, they simply ceased to exist. As the driver attempted the sharp left turn, the sedan's momentum betrayed it. The car didn't stop. It plowed through the intersection, clipping a delivery truck before spinning violently out of control. The sound was the worst part. It wasn't like the movies. It was the tearing of metal, a high-pitched scream of steel on concrete that vibrated in Seo-yeon's teeth. The car flipped, rolling once, twice, before slamming upside down into a concrete pillar. The windows exploded outwards, a shower of diamonds in the headlights. Seo-yeon stopped running, the camera slipping from her numb fingers. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The king had fallen, and his crown lay shattered in the street. The VIP wing of the hospital was designed to keep the world out. A fortress of marble floors and hushed tones, guarded by men with bulges under their jackets. But Seo-yeon had spent 3 years learning how to be invisible. She was a ghost in her own life, adept at slipping through the cracks of perception. A stolen volunteer badge, a lowered head, and a confident stride past a distracted nurse station were all it took. Inside the suite, the air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and expensive lilies. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator, a synthetic breath for a man who had commanded the city without uttering a word. Seo-yeon stood in the darkest corner of the room for a long time, her back pressed against the wall, just watching. Lee Min-jae looked devastatingly small in the center of the vast, sterile bed. The accident had stripped him of his armor. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by a thin hospital gown that exposed the tattoos crawling up his chest. His face, usually a mask of icy indifference, was a map of trauma, bruised, swollen, and wrapped in thick gauze. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a ruin. She moved closer, her footsteps soundless on the linoleum. She stopped at his bedside, her hand hovering over his, terrified to touch the skin she had only ever seen through a telephoto lens. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words trembling in the silence. "I tried to warn you. I screamed, but I'm just a ghost, aren't I? You never hear ghosts." The machine beeped steadily, indifferent to her grief. She knew the prognosis. She had listened from the janitor's closet while the doctor spoke to his lieutenants. Severe traumatic brain injury, swelling, unlikely to wake. "I should leave you alone," she murmured, tears finally spilling over. "But I can't. I haven't been able to leave you alone for 1,095 days. She leaned in, her need to confess overpowering her fear. If he was dying, he deserved to know that he hadn't been alone, that someone had borne witness to his life. "I know you hate the rain because it makes your knee ache from that fight in Busan," she confessed to his closed eyes. "I know you order black coffee but never drink the last sip. I have walls covered in you, Min-jae. Every moment you thought you were solitary, I was there. I stole your image because it was the only way I could keep you." She choked on a sob, leaning down so her lips were inches from his ear. "I'm just the stalker, the crazy girl in the shadows, but I loved you. I loved you more than any of them." She pulled back, wiping her eyes, preparing to turn and vanish forever. The rhythm of the heart monitor changed. It didn't flatline, it spiked. A low, guttural sound tore from Min-jae's throat, a sound of pure, animalistic distress. His hand shot out with terrifying speed, clamping around Seo-yeon's wrist. His grip was bruising, desperate, like a man falling off a cliff. Seo-yeon gasped, freezing in place. Min-jae's eyes flew open. There was no recognition in them, no intelligence, but a swirling, chaotic storm of black violence. He stared right through her, seeing a world on fire, but his grip on her arm tightened, anchoring him to the only sound that had penetrated the darkness. The king was awake, but the man was gone. The room erupted into white noise. Doctors swarmed in, a blur of white coats and shouting mouths that Min-jae perceived only as a deafening, distorted screech. To him, they weren't healers, they were threats, jagged shapes in a fracturing reality. He roared, a sound of raw fury, and swung his free arm. A tray of metal instruments clattered across the room, silencing the staff instantly. But his other hand never loosened its vice-like grip on Seo-yeon's wrist. "Min-jae, you have a cerebral edema," a brave resident stammered, stepping forward. "You need to stay lying down." Min-jae ripped the IV line from his arm, a spray of dark blood spattering against the pristine sheets. He didn't even flinch. His eyes, wild and dilated, were locked onto Seo-yeon. He looked at her not with affection, but with the terrifying intensity of a drowning man clutching driftwood. "Talk," he commanded, his voice a ruined rasp. "Say it again. The tiger." The tiger sleeps beneath the mountain," Seo-yeon whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trembling, caught between the urge to run and the paralyzing realization that the most dangerous man in Seoul was currently hiding behind her voice. "Good," he breathed, the tension in his shoulders dropping an inch. "We're leaving." He swung his legs off the bed, stumbling as his equilibrium failed him. Seo-yeon instinctively caught him, her small frame buckling under his dead weight. He smelled of sweat, blood, and fear. His security detail, massive men in dark suits who had rushed in at the commotion, hesitated. They had never seen their boss like this, broken, bleeding, yet emanating a feral danger that made their instincts scream. "Boss," the head of security started, "the doctor says—" "Get the car," Min-jae snarled, leaning heavily on Seo-yeon, dragging her through the door toward the elevator. "Take me to the penthouse, now." "I can't go with you," Seo-yeon stammered, trying to pry his fingers from her bruised skin. "I'm just a volunteer. I have to—" Min-jae stopped. He looked down at her, and for a second, the violence in his eyes was replaced by a hollow, bottomless terror. "If you stop speaking, the noise comes back. If the noise comes back, I kill everyone in this room." It wasn't a threat. It was a diagnosis. Seo-yeon stopped fighting. She let him pull her through the corridors, past the terrified nurses, and into the waiting elevator. The ride down was a blur of nausea and heat. Min-jae stood pressed against her, his forehead resting on her shoulder, shaking. The drive was worse. Every honk, every siren made him flinch and tighten his grip until Seo-yeon thought her bones would snap. She kept whispering nursery rhymes, weather reports, anything to keep the static at bay. When they finally reached his private estate, a fortress of concrete and glass overlooking the Han River, he didn't let her go. He dragged her through the grand foyer, past the confused servants, and into the master suite. He shoved the heavy double doors shut and locked them, sealing the world out. Seo-yeon stood in the dark room, shivering. She was trapped in the lion's den, and the lion was blocking the only exit. The master suite was a cavern of shadows, the only light coming from the lightning flashing violently against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Min-jae paced the length of the room, a caged tiger trying to walk off a tranquilizer dart. His head was pounding, a rhythmic, sickening thud that synced with the storm outside. Seo-yeon stood by the door, clutching her canvas tote bag to her chest like a shield. She watched him with wide, terrified eyes. She knew what was in the bag. She knew that if he looked inside, the fragile truce of her voice would shatter, and he would see her for what she really was, a parasite feeding on his existence. "Give it to me," Min-jae rasped, stopping abruptly. He pointed a trembling finger at the bag. "Min-jae, please, it's just personal items." "I said, give it to me." He didn't wait. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, snatching the strap from her numb fingers. He was looking for weapons, for bugs, for the source of the betrayal that had put him in that car. He upended the bag onto the silk duvet of his bed. There was no gun. There was no wire. Instead, a heavy, leather-bound journal hit the mattress with a thud, spilling loose photographs across the dark fabric. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Seo-yeon squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the anger, waiting for the bullet. Silence. Min-jae stared down at the bed. The static in his head, which had been screaming since he woke up, suddenly dipped in volume. He reached out, his hands shaking, and picked up a photograph. It was him. But it wasn't the face he saw in the mirror, the cold, hard mask of the chairman. It was a photo taken through a rainy cafe window. He was looking down at a cup of coffee, his guard completely down, a rare expression of exhaustion and loneliness etched into his features. He picked up another, him feeding a stray cat in the alley behind the club. Another, him standing on the roof of his headquarters, looking up at the moon with a desperate hunger. He flipped open the journal. It wasn't a log of his crimes. It was a poetry of his movements. March 3rd. He rubbed his left knee 3 times today. The rain makes him hurt. April 12th. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened when he saw the flower vendor. Min-jae felt a strange sensation wash over him, cooling the fire in his brain. For 3 years he had felt entirely alone, surrounded by men who only saw his power. But this girl, She had seen the man. She had catalogued his humanity when he thought he had none left. "You," Min-jae whispered, tracing the date on a page. "You didn't just find me in the hospital." "I'm sorry," Seo-yeon wept softly. "I'm so sorry." Min-jae looked up. For the first time since the crash, his eyes were clear. He didn't feel violated. He didn't feel stalked. He felt found. "Don't apologize," he said, his voice thick with a twisted kind of awe. He held up a picture of himself sleeping on a park bench, a moment of vulnerability he didn't even remember. He dropped the photo and stepped toward her, the predator gone, replaced by something far more intense. The boardroom was a mausoleum of black marble and cold steel. Min-jae sat at the head of the long table, his posture rigid, his hands resting flat on the surface to hide the tremors. To the outside world, he was the picture of composed authority. Inside his head, however, the world was a terrifying, abstract painting. The heavy double doors swung open, and 4 men walked in. Min-jae's breath hitched. He knew these men. He had known them for a decade. But as they approached, their faces swam in his vision, features melting into sliding pools of flesh and static. He couldn't distinguish a smile from a snarl. He couldn't tell who was the loyalist and who was the traitor. They were just faceless predators in expensive suits, smelling of cologne and ambition. "Breathe," Seo-yeon's voice whispered in his right ear, clear and steady through the microscopic earpiece. "Shoulders back, chin up. You own the air they breathe." Min-jae adjusted instantly, his spine snapping straight. He felt a phantom warmth, as if she were standing right behind him, though she was locked in the security room 3 floors down, watching the feed on a bank of monitors. The men took their seats. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "The man on your immediate left is Director Han," Seo-yeon murmured. "He's sweating. He's tapping his ring against the glass. Nervous tick. He lost $2 million in the Macau casino last night. Use it." Min-jae turned his head slowly to the left. To him, Han was a gray smudge with a voice. But Min-jae didn't need to see. He had Seo-yeon's eyes. "Macau was expensive this time of year, Han," Min-jae said, his voice low and bored. The tapping sound stopped instantly. The blur that was Director Han stiffened. "Good," Seo-yeon whispered. "Now the man across from him, Choi. He's smiling, but his hands are clenched under the table. He's the one who questioned your health report. Stare him down. Don't blink." Min-jae shifted his gaze, locking his unseeing eyes onto the vague shape of Choi. He forced himself to stare into the void, letting the silence do the work. He imagined Seo-yeon in the dark room, her face illuminated by the screens, her lips moving against the microphone, puppeteering his survival. "I hear there are rumors," Min-jae said softly, echoing the script Seo-yeon had prepared for him earlier. "Rumors that the king is broken." "Lean forward," Seo-yeon commanded. "Choi is reaching for his water glass. Intimidate him before he drinks." Min-jae leaned in, the movements sharp and predatory. "Do I look broken to you, Choi?" The Choi flinched. The glass clattered against the coaster. "No, boss," Choi stammered. "You look focused." "He's lying, but he's terrified," Seo-yeon said, her voice dropping to a soothing hum that coated Min-jae's frayed nerves like balm. "You have them. They don't see a blind man. They see a monster who knows their secrets." For the next hour, they moved as one organism. She was the brain, he was the fist. Every time the static threatened to rise, every time the faces distorted into nightmarish shapes, her voice anchored him. She fed him names, numbers, and leverage she had gathered from years of obsession. When the meeting ended and the men filed out, pale and shaken, Min-jae didn't move. He waited until the door clicked shut. "Are they gone?" he asked the empty room. "They're gone," Seo-yeon replied, and for the first time, Min-jae heard the exhaustion in her voice. "You did it, Min-jae. You're still the king." Min-jae closed his eyes, leaning back against the leather chair. "No," he whispered to the invisible woman in his ear. "We are." The triumph of the boardroom evaporated the moment the sky tore open. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge that hammered against the penthouse glass like 1,000 fists demanding entry. For Min-jae, whose brain was already a minefield of misfiring synapses, the sudden drop in barometric pressure was a declaration of war. He was in the library when the first migraine spike hit, a jagged bolt of white agony that dropped him to his knees. He overturned a heavy oak desk, trying to find something to hold on to, sending a crystal lamp shattering across the floor. Seo-yeon found him in the center of the wreckage. The King of Seoul was reduced to a snarling, blinded creature, clawing at his own scalp, as if trying to dig the pain out. "Min-jae!" she cried out, but the thunder swallowed her voice. He didn't hear her. The static in his head was a deafening scream. When she approached, he lashed out, his arms swinging blindly. His knuckles grazed her hip, hard enough to leave a mark, but she didn't retreat. She knew that if she left him now, the pressure in his skull would kill him. He would die alone in the dark. She abandoned the safety of the doorway. She scrambled over the broken glass and scattered books, throwing herself at him. She didn't use her voice this time. The storm was too loud. She used her body. She grabbed his face, her palms cool and firm against his burning skin. She forced his head up, pressing her thumbs into the pressure points at his temples with practiced, desperate force. Min-jae roared, his body seizing, ready to crush the threat. Then his eyes snapped open. He saw her, not a blur, not a ghost. Her face was inches from his, pale and terrified, damp hair plastered to her cheeks. She was the only thing in the room that wasn't vibrating. "Breathe," she mouthed, the word of physical sensation against his lips. She slid her hands over his ears, pressing tight, creating a human seal against the thunder. The silence was instant. It was a vacuum that sucked the agony right out of his marrow. Min-jae collapsed forward, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged and wet. The medical necessity of the moment shifted in a heartbeat. He realized, with a jolt of adrenaline that had nothing to do with pain, that he was between her legs, her body cradling his weight. The scent of her, vanilla and fear, flooded his senses, overriding the metallic taste of blood. He wasn't just using her for silence anymore. He was addicted to her existence. His hands, shaking and bloodied, moved to her waist, gripping her with a possession that bordered on violence. "Don't move," he rasped, his voice a broken growl. He didn't wait for a response. He closed the distance, capturing her mouth with a hunger that had been building since the hospital. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a reclamation. He devoured her gasp, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, tasting the life he had almost lost. Seo-yeon froze, then melted, her fingers twisting into his shirt, anchoring the monster she had saved. The peace was a lie, fragile as the glass walls that surrounded them. Min-jae lay on the Persian rug, his head resting heavily in Seo-yeon's lap, finally asleep. The storm had passed, leaving the city below washed clean and glittering. For the first time in years, the penthouse was quiet, not the oppressive silence of isolation, but the warm, breathing silence of companionship. Then the world ended with a click. It wasn't a flicker. The power to the estate didn't fail. It was executed. The hum of the refrigerator, the low thrum of the air filtration, the ambient glow of the security panels, everything died instantly. The penthouse plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt physical, like thick velvet pressed against the eyes. Min-jae woke instantly, but he didn't wake to clarity. Without the ambient light, his vision reverted to the terrifying, distorted grayscale of his injury. "Seo-yeon?" he rasped, his hand shooting out to find her. He felt the warmth of her leg, but she was already moving, her body tense. "Someone's here," she whispered, the the terror in her voice cutting through his drowsiness like a blade. "The security system, it's offline." Before Min-jae could rise, the breach occurred. There was no explosion, no dramatic entrance, just the sound of the front doors sliding open and the heavy, synchronized thud of boots on marble. They moved with the precision of a kill squad. "Run!" Min-jae snarled, trying to push himself up, but the sudden movement sent a spike of vertigo crashing through his skull. He stumbled, his equilibrium shattered by the dark. "I'm not leaving you!" Seo-yeon cried, grabbing his arm. That was her mistake. A beam of tactical light cut through the room, blindingly bright, disorienting Min-jae further. He roared, lashing out at the light, but he was fighting ghosts. A taser prong hit him square in the chest, locking his muscles in a rigid, agonizing spasm. He hit the floor hard. Through the paralysis and the rising static in his ears, he heard the struggle. "Don't hurt him!" Seo-yeon screamed, the sound moving away from him. "Take me! Just take me!" "Secure the anchor," a cold, familiar voice ordered from the shadows. It was Choi. "He's nothing without the bitch." Min-jae fought the voltage, his finger scraping uselessly against the marble. He could hear her fighting, the scuff of sneakers, a muffled cry, the sound of fabric tearing. "Min-jae!" Her voice was raw, desperate, and then suddenly cut off. The doors slid shut. The tactical lights vanished. Min-jae was left alone in the crushing dark. The silence of the penthouse returned, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a tomb. And then, slowly, terrifyingly, the noise in his head began to rise, a screaming, chaotic static that had no voice to soothe it down.
The silence in Min-jae's head was gone, replaced by a wall of white noise so dense it felt like his skull was being crushed in a hydraulic press. He couldn't think. He couldn't plan, but he didn't need to think, to kill. He rose from the marble floor, a creature of pure instinct. His vision was a kaleidoscope of gray shadows and blinding pain, but his body remembered what his mind had forgotten. Decades of violence had etched a map into his muscles. When a shadow lunged at him from the hallway, one of Choi's men left behind to finish the job, Min-jae didn't hesitate. He sidestepped the knife thrust with a fluid, ghostly motion and drove his palm into the attacker's throat. Cartilage crunched. The shadow fell. Min-jae stepped over the body, moving toward the service elevator. He was navigating by echolocation and rage, following the phantom trail of Seo-yeon's scream. "Get to the anchor," the thought repeated on a loop, the only coherent signal in the storm. He descended into the bowels of the building. The underground garage was a vast, echoing chamber of concrete and exhaust fumes. The cold air bit at his skin, sharpening his senses. The static in his ears was deafening, a roar of confused neurons, but through it he heard a whimpering sound. He stopped. He turned his head, the predator locking on to its prey. 30 yards away, beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, Choi and two others were dragging Seo-yeon toward a waiting black van. She was fighting them, kicking and twisting, a small, desperate animal in a trap. "Get her in the van," Choi shouted, raising a pistol to pistol whip her into submission. The blow connected. Seo-yeon's head snapped back. She slumped against the side of the van, sliding down to the concrete. Time seemed to warp for Min-jae. The static didn't get louder. It froze. He saw it with impossible clarity, a single rivet of bright crimson blood trickling down Seo-yeon's pale temple. It pooled at her jawline, staining the collar of her white blouse. The color red. It was the first color he had truly seen in weeks. It burned through the grayscale of his injury like acid. The sight of her blood, the blood of the woman who had kept him alive, the woman who had whispered to his ghosts, acted as a violent defibrillator to his fractured memory. The barrier in his mind shattered. The static vanished. The confusion evaporated. The fog lifted, revealing the sharp, brutal architecture of his past. He remembered everything. He remembered the taste of the whiskey he drank the night of the crash. He remembered the exact weight of the gun he used to carry. And he remembered who he was. He wasn't a broken invalid. He wasn't a confused animal relying on a keeper. Min-jae straightened his spine, his shoulders rolling back, the feral desperation in his face smoothed out, replaced by a mask of terrifying, icy calm. He walked out of the shadows, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, echoing against the concrete walls like a death knell. Choi looked up, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He froze, his gun lowering slightly as he saw the man walking toward him. It wasn't the invalid he had left on the floor. Min-jae didn't run. He didn't scream. He simply walked, his eyes burning with a cold, restored intelligence. "Get her low," Min-jae said. His voice wasn't a rasp anymore. It was deep, resonant, and absolutely lethal. "Or pray your death is faster than my memory."
Choi fired, but he was shooting at a memory of a broken man. Min-jae moved with a terrifying, fluid precision that defied the laws of physics. He twisted the first guard's wrist until the bone snapped with a wet crunch, claiming the weapon in one seamless motion. 2 shots rang out, controlled, efficient, final. The guards collapsed before they hit the concrete. Choi scrambled backward, his heels skidding on the oil-stained floor, his gun forgotten. He opened his mouth to beg, but Min-jae didn't offer a trial. He offered an execution. A single bullet silenced the betrayal forever. Min-jae didn't watch the body fall. He dropped the gun and fell to his knees beside Seo-yeon, his hands instantly finding her face. He wiped the blood from her temple with his thumb, his expression shattering from cold rage into desperate adoration. "Min-jae?" she whispered, flinching as she looked into his eyes. She saw it instantly. The fog was gone. The dull, confused glaze was replaced by a razor-sharp darkness. "You remember?" "Everything," he replied, his voice steady and low. "The accident, the betrayal, you." Seo-yeon let out a ragged breath, pulling away from his touch. "Then you're healed," she said, her voice hollow. "You don't need a human anchor anymore. I was just a medical necessity. I should go." She tried to stand, shame coloring her cheeks. She was just the stalker again, the girl with the camera who had overstayed her welcome. Min-jae's hand shot out, capturing her wrist. He didn't pull her hard. He just held her, an immovable object. "I'm not keeping you because I'm broken, Seo-yeon." He pulled her back down until they were eye to level. "I'm keeping you because I'm selfish." He pressed her palm against his chest, right over the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. "The static is gone. My mind is clear. But if you leave, the silence will be worse than the noise ever was. Your voice isn't my medicine anymore. It's my oxygen." Seo-yeon searched his face for a lie and found only absolute, terrifying devotion. "You want the stalker?" "I want the queen," he corrected, leaning in to kiss the blood from her skin. 6 months later, the Obsidian Club was louder than usual, filled with the elite of the underworld. When the double doors opened, the room fell silent. Lee Min-jae walked in, looking every inch the emperor who had returned from the dead. But he didn't walk alone. Beside him, dressed in midnight silk that matched his suit, was Seo-yeon. She wasn't hiding in the corner with a camera lens pressed to her eye. She was on his arm, her head held high, her eyes scanning the room with a sharpness Min-jae had taught her. Min-jae leaned down, ignoring the hundreds of people watching them. "Tell me what you see," he whispered. Seo-yeon smiled, tightening her grip on his hand. "I see a kingdom," she whispered back, "and it's ours."